He's right in all matters. Go ahead.
But this heavenly voice isn't changing the law of the Torah; it's just clarifying what the law is. So that's the part I don't get.
What it's changing
it's
is
not
the
a voice saying, "Hey, don't follow this law," or
I'll tell you what it's changing. It's changing the process. The Torah tells us, it lays out a process that you have to follow the majority. This idea would circumvent the majority.
Okay.
So it's changing. No, one second. Hang on. It is changing a law in the Torah. There's no question that the Torah says the way the law is decided is by majority when there is a difference of opinion among the Bezdin. To come out with a heavenly voice saying, forget your opinions, do like his opinion, that contravenes follow the majority.
But that verse, Exodus 23:2, doesn't even say follow the majority like I showed you this week.
There's another verse that says it. Again, I don't want to, we'll talk about later why they use that verse. It does say that. It says only in the case of capital punishment is a simple majority not enough. That's what that verse says. But in all other cases, a simple majority is enough. So assume for a moment that I know a little bit what I'm talking about in that regard as to what the verse says. It actually says, Achrei Rabbi Mahatas. There's a very clear law about this as well. So when the heavenly voice comes down, it is trying to change the judicial process. It's saying that a heavenly voice came, tells us that Rabbi Eliezer is right. Everyone should now bow down and say, okay, Rabbi Eliezer, you're right. They say no. So why was there such a heavenly voice? What was God was fooling with them? He was toying with them? He was playing with them? What's the point?
Well, it's possible the sages were just wrong and he should have accepted those.
That is possible. But I'm asking according to the Gemara. The sages recorded this. They recorded this for a purpose. What was their thinking about this? How did they see this heavenly voice? Anybody? The question is good. In other words, what's the point of all this? So there is much ink that is spilled on this issue. But I want to use today the approach of the Ben Ish Chai, Rabbi Yosef Chaim of Baghdad, who describes it as follows. Text 168. Can I have a reader, please? Loud and clear, Bernie.
Certainly it was God who caused the miracles and the heavenly voice that supported the view of Rabbi Eliezer. He did so in order to secure the future of Torah on a steadfast foundation. God knew that the sages were resolute in truth-seeking. He knew that the miracles and the heavenly voice that supported of Rabbi Eliezer would not convince the sages to contravene even one command of the Torah, including the instruction to follow the majority. God therefore caused the miracles and the heavenly voice that the sages disregarded it would generate an important precedent for future generations. No person would ever be able to nullify even one word of the Torah. For if even the miracles and the heavenly voice could not persuade the sages to change the Torah law, certainly then nothing would be able to persuade us to do so. God intended that the awesomeness of this story and the publicity it engendered should result in its lesson remaining with the Jewish people for all generations.
Most commentaries, at least in part of their analysis of this story, include this idea. That the purpose of this story, and particularly the purpose of placing it in the Talmud for all time, was that the Jewish people in these times, Talmudic times, they were facing persecution from Christians. They were facing persecution sometimes from Zoroastrians. They were now going to go into a long, bitter exile that we're still in. And they understood that there were going to be trials and tribulations and attempts from all sides to contravene Torah law, as we learned earlier from the Chassam Sofer. And basically it's saying, look, no matter what you say, no matter what miracle you bring, no matter what proof you want to bring that you have heard from God a new law, no matter what, I can tell you, it ain't happening. We don't accept it. If all of those sages heard the voice of God, and I trust them, they all heard it together, not one person, not three people, a whole group of sages sitting in a room, and they agree that they heard it. They're not questioning whether or not they heard the godly voice. They heard it. But but it couldn't even change their mind, certainly you're not going to change my mind. And this is why this becomes, and as the Chassam Sofer describes it, a foundational teaching in the Talmud. For this very point, that nothing can come along and change the immutability of the written and received oral law. Even a heavenly voice can't alter Torah. Okay? So here comes a heavenly voice supporting Rabbi Eliezer, contrary to the law, and that the final ruling follows the majority, so that the sages would disagree with the voice, and thereby they'd set the precedent forever that nothing can change the Torah. This is how the Talmud describes this story. So does that mean it can never be changed? There's nothing ever, ever, ever? No, there are sometimes. After all that, I'll tell you when it's possible. So the first case is a temporary injunction. A prophet comes along and says, guys, all of the laws of the Torah stand, they're in place. But there is a concept, eis lasis la Hashem hefera Torah, which means this is a unique moment, and for a temporary injunction, even though the law is such, for a short period of time, there is an injunction and something can be contravened. Let's see a story of this, of one of the greatest of all the prophets. Yeah, you wanted to ask something?
No, I mean, there's even a more recent example of that, like not fasting on Yom Kippur during a plague or something like that. The rabbis have declared,
No, that would not be, because the fasting on Yom Kippur is subject to the rule that goes with all of mitzvot in the written Torah, b'chai b'hem, that the mitzvahs were given to, and not to, so in a case of life or death, there's no question that there's no fasting on Yom Kippur. Nobody argues with that. Nobody argues with that. And the law also describes, so how do we determine that? So it depends on doctors, it depends on, in this case, a plague, epidemiologists, I don't know what, that would tell us that this is a dangerous plague, and therefore we would have to listen to them and eat on Yom Kippur. I have a fellow who I know very, very well, an elderly man who is he's advanced in his age, and he has all kinds of medication he needs to take, and all kinds of things. And every year around Yom Kippur, he gets into a fight with his wife and me, and he says, I'm not drinking or eating on Yom Kippur, and I say, the same God who said you have to fast on Yom Kippur, through me, spoke to me, and told me to tell you, you need to eat on it, you need to drink, you need to take your medicine, because that's what the doctor said. So, and that would apply to any, now that doesn't mean that I need my vitamins, and so I can now drink on Yom Kippur. That's not what I'm saying. It really does have to be a life and death situation, or similar, but that's, go to your local Orthodox rabbi and they'll help you with that decision. Okay, but let's take an example from the times of the prophets, one of the greatest prophets of all time, and that would be Elijah the prophet. So, there was a case where he suspended a mitzvah. Now there is just some background. The mitzvah is that, well, first the story. Israel was separated into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And the northern kingdom had abandoned Torah and mitzvahs, and they had gone on to idolatry. Actually, primarily idolatry. They might have done a lot of mitzvahs, but they were idolaters. And Elijah, and many of them followed the cult of the time, the Baal. And Elijah the prophet wanted to return Jews to their Judaism, and so he challenged the priests of the Baal to a public spectacle to see who would be sort of the true prophet of God. And in order to do that, he challenged them at high noon to a duel. And the duel was, who was going to be able to have a heavenly fire come down on a sacrifice on the top of the mountain that they set up. So all the people gathered around, thousands of people, and all these priests of the Baal, they did all their shenanigans, they danced and they sang and they wept and they tore their clothes and their hair out and they did a whole kind of voodoo dance or whatever, and nothing happened. And Elijah the prophet put a sacrifice up there afterwards, after they were all done. First he poked fun at them, and he made all kinds of fun of them. A very interesting story. It's an unusual story in the Torah. And he pours water on the altar, so it should be completely saturated with water, and then he puts an animal up on the altar, and a heavenly fire comes down in front of everybody, and everybody realizes that this is something different. The only problem with this story is that you're not allowed to bring sacrifices outside of the temple. You're not allowed to put an animal on an altar outside of the temple. It is exclusively, once the temple is built, it is exclusively something that happens in the temple, nowhere else. You're not allowed to. That's what the Torah says. So how did he do this? Okay? So let's take a look at text 10 from Maimonides. Penny, will you read for us?
Sure.
Thank you.
When people who have already established themselves as prophets instruct us to violate one of the mitzvot of the Torah, or many mitzvot, no matter their severity, but only for a limited amount of time, it is the mitzvah to listen to them. We have learned this from the earlier sages who transmitted this received law. Hearken to everything a prophet tells you, even to violate a precept of the Torah, like Elijah did on Mount Carmel, but only do so if this is a temporary instruction, and do not hearken even temporarily if he tells you to serve idols.
So, if a prophet comes along, an established prophet, we know he's a prophet. Elijah was known as a prophet. And he comes along and he says, today, one day, injunction, today, for the purpose of this event, even though there's a law in the Torah, and the law stands that you can't sacrifice outside the temple, but for one day, as a temporary measure, we can do this. So you're allowed to, you must listen to the prophet, only as a temporary measure. Except if he says, as a temporary measure, let's all worship idols, or one person to worship idols. That you can't say. So it would be like saying you have a general who's given the leeway to, at times, circumvent the higher-ups in sort of on the battlefield for a moment, to circumvent his command for a moment. But the one thing he can't circumvent is to say, don't listen to the higher-ups. He can't, in other words, he can circumvent temporarily any mitzvah. Temporarily, only a prophet can. But, or at least now we're talking about a prophet. But not on a permanent basis. One-time thing. But this also applies to a rabbinic court, to a Sanhedrin, that can also have this power as well. What is the example? Text 11 on page 170. If a bet din deems it appropriate to temporarily suspend a positive or negative commandment in order to bring many people back to the Jewish faith, or to prevent many Jews from committing various transgressions, they may do whatever is necessary at that time. Just like a doctor amputates a person's hand or foot so the person will live, so too at times the court may rule to temporarily violate some of the mitzvot to preserve overall mitzvah observance. In this vein, the sages of the previous generation said, desecrate one Shabbat for a person's sake, so that the person will keep many a Shabbat. This happened, if you look back in Jewish history, that a bet din said this. This happened it was an extremely uncommon occurrence in all of Jewish history. So, in summation, even a heavenly voice does not cause us to change anything in the Torah. A prophet or a proper bet din, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment, can temporarily suspend a law in order for the purpose of either a large, bringing a people back to Judaism, or to stop a greater prohibition. Now I'm just going to digress for a moment and talk about who is this bet din that we're talking about now and we're going to talk about more in a moment. Who is qualified to make these decisions? So I'll tell you three basic criteria, and again, this is on a very basic level, but these criteria are absolutely critical for anybody to be involved in any of these decisions. Absolutely critical. And if you don't have this criteria, I'm going to talk about three things. If somebody doesn't have this criteria, they absolutely have no business talking about changing something, and we're going to talk about change in a second, changing or violating something even temporarily if they don't have these three criteria. So here they are. Number one, they have to believe in Torah law, meaning that the Torah is from God, and that this is sort of the rule of law of the Jewish people. They have to believe in it. Number two, they have to follow it. They have to practice it. So somebody who doesn't believe that the Torah is from God, of course it's going to be easy to change it. Somebody who may believe it's from God but doesn't practice it, that would be like saying, if a person is a felon, they can't retain they're not a member in good standing of the bar, so to say. In other words, if you want to serve in the court, you have to be an upstanding member of the bar. And finally, the third, so they have to believe in the law, have to follow the law, and the third criteria is that they have to be knowledgeable in the law, in the actual intricacies of the law. 3 criteria. And that's before we start. Those are like absolutely basic to changing, and we're going to talk now about changing the law. Those are 3 criteria that you need to sit there and to have that discussion and to really be, if one doesn't believe in the law, or doesn't follow it, or doesn't know it, they certainly can't be involved in the discussion or the back and forth about changing it.
Rabbi,
Yes?
is Rabbi Maimonides established what is the temporal parameter?
Temporary?
Yeah.
He does talk about it. It's more detail how long and what that means. Yes, he does. I like how you call him Rabbi Maimonides. That's good. That's good. In the Hebrew Rambam, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. So the R in the Rambam is Rabbi. But that's good. Okay. Any questions before we go further? Because now we're up until now we've been talking about written and received. Now we're moving on. So those are areas that we can't change forever. We can only do temporarily, prophet, or a proper Sanhedrin doing it temporarily. Now let's talk about derived, legislated, and we'll maybe touch upon customary. We're very late. Okay. Any questions? No. Okay. So change may be possible in the area of derived. How would it be possible for 2 sages or 2 courts to have alternative readings of or divergent derivations from the written and received oral law? One could say that in this square, the number ought to be a 4. Remember in the Sudoku example. And somebody else might say the number here you can also do it a little differently, and this could fit as well. And there are the ability. Remember, we spoke about different opinions. Elu v'elu divrei Elokim chaim. There are possibilities either way.
Will they get to the same conclusion?
No, I'm talking about different conclusions. So how do we deal with it? So let's take a look at text 13 again from Maimonides. If the Sanhedrin used one of the hermeneutic rules as per their perception to derive a law and rule accordingly, and another court arose afterward whose reasoning dictated to revoke the previous ruling, they may revoke it and rule according to their perception. As it says, you shall go to the judge who will be in those days. This indicates that people are obligated to follow the court of their own generation. So this says, and we're going to, don't stop there. We're not done. The first point is that, theoretically at least, and we're going to get into the practicalities in a moment, the Rambam says that one Sanhedrin can overturn a previous Sanhedrin's ruling. You have the High Court of 70, they rule a particular way, a later court can come along and overturn that ruling. Okay? But to just clarify, before you get too excited, that doesn't mean that a single sage, or even a group of sages today, who disagree or have a divergent reading than the Sanhedrin did, can come along today and change what the Sanhedrin said. And why is that? Because we don't have a Sanhedrin today. We have a problem. We don't have a Sanhedrin. There hasn't been a Sanhedrin for many hundreds of years. So once the Sanhedrin, when there was a Sanhedrin one generation after another, there were times that the rule was one way, and later the rule could have changed. Today, though, you don't have that body anymore. And so that's why it is impossible today to overturn a Sanhedrin's ruling. But not only a Sanhedrin, as we learned before in Lesson 4, there is one other way in which a ruling becomes cemented into law for all of the Jewish people. Anyone recall what we said? How else can it be cemented into law for all the Jewish people? Not a majority. A majority of what, actually? We brought the example from the Talmud itself. The Talmud was sealed long after the Sanhedrin ceased to exist. But the reason that the Talmud is considered to be the ultimate codifier of Jewish law is because at the sealing of the Talmud, all or a vast majority of the sages who lived in that time gave their imprimatur. They agreed with the rulings of the Talmud, to abide by the rulings of the Talmud, and so this became law for the entirety of the Jewish people. Because the majority of all sages who lived in that time agreed with it, that has the power of a Sanhedrin. Since the closing of the Talmud, there has never been a situation where the majority of all of the sages of the Jewish people have agreed upon a single code or a single law as being such. So, for example, we take the Code of Jewish Law,